Terrific. Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Andrea Carice. I am the Associate Vice Principal of Research and Innovation at the University of Toronto Scarborough. I have the pleasure of hosting and moderating today's talk. As folks are arriving, I will just offer a brief summary for those of us that aren't yet familiar. What is the Earth District and why are we here? Before handing things over to Professor Imre Zeeman. So welcome everyone. This is our Earth District Speaker Series, a series that is recurring throughout 2025 and 2026 virtually, led by Earth District Consortium members, namely Centennial College, Fleming College, Ontario Tech University, Trent University, and the University of Toronto Scarborough. The Earth District Speaker Series is a dynamic forum designed to showcase innovative ideas, foster collaboration, and highlight the expertise within our consortium's community. We hope you enjoy today's session and join future ones. Before we start the presentation, a few housekeeping items. Teams has a closed captioning feature. If you'd like to utilize it, click on the More tab at the top, slide down to Language and Speech, and click Show Live Captions. Note that we will also be recording today's session to share later on the Earth District website for those who wish to view it at a later date, or perhaps, as an idea, integrate it into course materials. Lastly, please use the chat function on the right-hand side to offer your general comments, networking, and the Q&A box in particular. If you have questions for the speakers, we will be monitoring the chat and will flag discussion questions for our speakers to answer at the end of the presentation today. Please do make use of it. This is an opportunity for us to connect across multiple institutions, and in a multi-institution consortium like this, we're really looking for ways to enable folks to make connections that we might not be able to because of geography or discipline, or any number of other things that keep us locked in our own spheres of practice. So I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Professor Imre Zeeman, Director of the Institute for Environment, Conservation, and Sustainability. He's also Professor of Human Geography here at the University of Toronto Scarborough. His work explores how political power, ideology, and myth shape our understanding of climate change, fossil fuels, and the future of renewable energy. He is the co-founder of the Petrocultures Research Group, which explores the socio-cultural dimensions of energy use and its implications for energy transition and climate change. He is also the founder of the After Oil Collective. Imre Zeeman is author most recently of the book On Petrocultures, Globalization, Culture, and Energy, published in 2019, and Futures of the Sun, The Struggle Over Renewable Life in 2024. His other book, Power Shift, Keywords for a New Politics of Energy, co-edited with Jennifer Wenzel, will be published in spring 2025. And over and above all that, he is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. Imre, thank you so much for sharing your work, your experience, and just your incredible collaborations with us here today in the Earth District. It's my pleasure now to hand things over to you, and my thanks to Nancy Woon for all of the administrative and technical support for today as we do that. Imre, take it from here.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Nancy, and thanks to all of you who are joining in and listening to this presentation. I was going to say something just kind of, I don't know what it's a gesture that I was like people say when they give these kind of lectures. And I was going to say I'll try to keep it short. But even as I said that, I realized that's probably not true. But I'll do my best not to go on too long, because I would like to have a discussion about this presentation at the end of it. I see some names here that I'm familiar with and some that aren't. And I know that this material and the issues that I'll be talking about will look different from different disciplines. And that's part of why I wanted to give this presentation, to get your feedback, to learn about how each of you views this, and to have that discussion is more important to me than doing this presentation. So I'm going to read a section of that book, which Andrea mentioned, called Futures of the Sun. that was published in last fall by University of Minnesota Press. It is available online for free. You can't download it, but you can view it on the University of Minnesota Press's website. And I'll have a QR code posted up on the PowerPoint that you can scan if you want to access it. So what this book is about, it's about competing narratives over the transition. I should share my screen now. Okay, is that up? Yes? Okay, excellent. So this book is about competing narratives over the transition now taking place from fossil fuel energy to renewable energy. It's a book that looks at, when I say competing narratives, it's about the direction that the transition should take, who are going to be the agents of this transition, and what that outcome is going to look like of the transition should it take place. Now, this term transition is used a lot, energy transition, as a description of the integration of renewables into the energy that we use. One of the things we might want to discuss is whether we've been going through a transition at all, or something else is happening, because we've in fact been adding more energy overall, both clean and dirty energy, rather than quickly giving up on some older forms of energy and adding renewables. We do add more and more renewables as a proportion of the energy added each year, but that doesn't mean that we're limiting the amount of energy that we're using, nor that we're eliminating dirty energy as well. One of the reasons I wanted to talk about this book is to see if things have changed in the world of energy and the environment since it came out. The book came out in November 2024. Certainly, it does appear things have changed, at least on the surface of things. The US, Canada, and some other countries have doubled down on fossil fuels, deciding to link their futures to of their economies to dirty energy. The Trump administration is the most obvious country to do so. And the administration, it's not just that they're using fossil fuels, or that they want coal to be a site, coal extraction to once again generate jobs in the country, and also to be a source of the energy that the US draws on. I think what fascinates me is the degree to which renewable energy is seen as a political threat by the Trump administration and by other governments that have relied economically on dirty energy. It's at or near the top of the things that he and his administration want to put an end to. The very first statement that Trump made upon winning the second election was drill, baby, drill. And a large portion of his recent scree at the UN, about 25%, was spent decrying climate change and renewable energies and the advocates of both. Now, if not mounting an open attack, Canadian and provincial governments have also been quickly softening or removing policies and plans to encourage the use of renewables and to limit greenhouse gas production. It's one of the reasons to kind of track that we launched, the Institute launched a site called Canadian Climate Backtracker, which has been showing all of the policies which the Carney government has either canceled or new policies that they've made which will impede Canada's ability to meet its Paris targets. So that's just to give you a sense of that site. It's on the right-hand side of the slide. So we have some countries like Canada and the US who are doubling down on dirty energy production, but others are speeding ahead on adopting renewables. And 90% of the new energy last year on the planet was from renewable energy. As has been widely reported, China is certainly the leader in adopting renewable energy. In just the first 6 months of this year, China installed more than 250 gigawatts of solar capacity. Now that's twice as much as installed by the entire world over that same period, and is 10 times as much as installed in the US. Despite efforts by Trump, you can see here in one of the graphs, the recent rise in energy demand in the US has actually been met by renewables for the most part. By the measure of their own systems, other countries have adopted renewables even faster. So nations that average more than a 2.5% gain in solar's share of total electricity generation over a 3 to 5 year period are described as being solar super boomers. If at that rate of 2 to 5% gain each year, that would put these countries, depending on how high, at 50% of solar of their entire energy system over 20 years. That's that big list of countries in the middle of the slide, and they're not necessarily countries that one might expect to be adopters of renewables, or the ones that have renewables as having the biggest impact on their electrical systems. So anyway, I'm giving you these stats. I'm sure many of you who deal with energy or climate change or renewables, you see these stats a lot. And I'm not giving them, these aren't going to be what I talk about. I just wanted to give you some context as to what I'm about to read today. Because statistics like this, they only give us really a part of the picture on renewables. They 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 tell us about the adoption of renewables, at least in numerical terms, and the impact that this adoption might have on greenhouse gases. But what they don't do is they don't tell us why they're being adopted and how and by whom. And there's an intense politics that is taking place at this moment over energy, and it's why energy is on the front pages of newspapers around the world and is reported on as a dramatic play in the media of all kinds. So this question of how, why, by whom is just to give you kind of a sense of the types of narratives or the issues or questions that come up when we don't look at just the numbers, but about why something is taking place with respect to renewables. So there's kind of at least these 5 things that I think about. So the most obvious one that I think there's something wrong with, okay. I just saw a notice about a URL. Anyway, there's something wrong about, sorry, there's these 5 things. So the most common is about the adoption or rejection of renewables. And I think that's what often we hear about in the news or when we look at articles about renewables. But there's more than that. I think we also have to think about whether the adoption of renewables creates change, social, political, economic, and cultural change, as well as changes in energy systems, or whether the adoption reinforces the status quo in those systems. I think it's important to look at that in part because there does seem to be a sense in many places and amongst many people, amongst many organizations, that adopting renewables will lead to change in other parts of society as well. We have to look at whether and how energy adoption of renewables is about national energy sovereignty or national sovereignty, or it's about the exertion of geopolitical power. I think we have to look at the impact of renewables on everyday practices, whether it changes them, or again, whether it reinforces them in a way that doesn't contribute to the reduction of greenhouse gases overall, or indeed to human planetary impact. And then finally, I think one of the major things is about who's going to control these energy sources, these renewables. That there is the capacity and possibility for individuals to own renewables and generate energy themselves in a way that was very difficult or impossible when it came to the extraction of dirty energy. But what that means is open to question and something to be analyzed and discussed. And then there's also, though, the fact that a lot of the ownership and control is in play by governments and by big business. So I won't talk about this kind of bleak or bright solarities too much. Solarities is just a term that a group of us came up, which describes a formation created by, in, and around renewable energies. It doesn't refer to solar specifically, but it's trying to capture that there can be different kinds of renewables, different kinds of renewable systems that can emerge as we make this energy transition. That an energy transition may open up possibilities of broader change. It also may shut them down. Energy is so important. Why would we even imagine that these changes of technologies and energy sources would make these other kinds of changes? I think it's for two reasons. One is that we know the impact of the adoption of fossil fuels, that the impact it's had on the shape and character of modernity, on the expectations people have on what they can do, on what we do daily and take as the norm. And the importance as well of energy suggests that new forms of energy might open up the capacity for us to act and be in different ways than we have been until recently. Okay, so that's just a kind of a framing so that those who have not done the kind of work that I'm about to do can have a better sense. I'm a social and cultural critic. I really try to attend to narratives, to how we describe something, to what that might mean for how individuals and communities act in relationship to something that is developing. And that's what I'm going to be talking about with respect to energy transition over the rest of this lecture. So let me get down to it. Who owns the sun? It's a seemingly ridiculous question. I mean, one could imagine sci-fi narratives in which moons or planets might eventually become subject to the law of property, like maybe subdivisions on the moon or rights to mining on Mars. But it seems impossible to own the sun. There's just no way one could put up fences on its surface or collect up all the energies it shines out to the universe. But in ways that I've been describing so far at the beginning, this battle over just who owns the energy of the sun is now in the process of being fought out. The practices of energy ownership definitive of the era of fossil fuels are in all too many cases being quickly extended to renewables. The ownership with which I'm concerned in this lecture, it's not just control over renewable energy technologies, sites, systems, or networks by companies or governments, or it's at least not only about that. It's about who's trying to lay claim to the narratives guiding our transition from fossil fuels to renewable energies, how they're doing so, and why and to what ends. I'm trying to do two things at once here. It's turning out too hard. The emergence of renewables as a source of power that might soon eclipse fossil fuels constitutes a transition whose effects go well beyond the type of energy we use. Even the International Energy Agency recognizes this. As early as 2022, the IEA's World Energy Outlook report projected that owing to the rapid greening of energy systems, CO2 emissions from the power sector will, in its 2022 report, it said that it'll likely peak in 2025. The report notes, quote, global fossil fuel use has risen alongside gross domestic product since the start of the Industrial Revolution in the 18th century. Putting this rise into reverse while continuing to expand the global economy will be a pivotal moment in energy history, end quote. For many around the world, this civilizational shift that the IEA points to promises new economic, social, and political possibilities. For others, it's a threat to be managed, controlled, or eliminated altogether. Even in the IEA short summary of where we now find ourselves in energy history, one can find an example of the narratives of the transition that interests me and the social and political imaginaries that play within them. For the IEA, the continued expansion of the global economy is a priority above all else. And though the reduction of CO2 emissions is to be welcomed, I mean, how could it not be? The uncertainties of the post-fossil fuel world for the IEA and others are definitely not. These uncertainties go beyond figuring out how to balance economic expansion with climate change mitigation strategies. They extend to what 2025, in this accounting at least, means for the future of capitalism and to the possibility of deep disruptions to the norms and values that underpinned the production, distribution, and consumption of all things, including energy, from the start of the age of oil up to the present. The anxiety that the IEA expresses, which positions renewable energies and growth as potential antagonists, is a common one, and indeed it might be seen as the starting point for all narratives intent on explaining the shape our renewable futures will take. The current forceful pushback on renewables by some governments and the fossil fuel industry is due in part to their understanding of the antagonism, of this antagonism as an immutable reality. They argue that growth is impossible without fossil fuels, and that working class jobs depend on the continuation of extraction. And for this reason alone, transition must happen slowly and steadily, if indeed it is to take place at all. But at this point in history, even those governments and fossil fuel companies resistant to energy transition recognize its inevitability. That's something which maybe we can talk about. Maybe now this is an overstatement, 6 months on from the publication of the book. Delay tactics on transition, typical delay tactics hope only to push the peak date of 2025 forward in time to 2030 or 2040 or even later, so that in the interim, profit can continue to be reaped on capital invested in extraction. These aren't the only arguments to keep the energy status quo and reap the supposed benefits that accompany it. Other narratives have tried to diffuse post-oil uncertainties by showing how the rise of renewables will result in economic growth. If one side fears renewables because it is supposed to lead to a decline in growth, other narratives try to say that that's not the case. In fact, renewables will lead to economic growth. Such narratives position renewables as a way of securing a green, clean future for existing forms of capitalist enterprise. And then there is a position that opposes this one, which sees the threat of climate change and the advent of renewable energies as opportunities to question the legitimacy and necessity of the growth of GDP on into perpetuity. Theorists of degrowth have made powerful arguments against the rationale for measuring human well-being by the metric of economic growth and have proposed ways to envision human flourishing that would not come at the expense of the environment. In this book, Futures of the Sun, I address these varying attempts to shape our energy futures, but I also focus on a far messier set of narratives being written, told, and sold about who should own the sun, of course, standing in for all renewables, who should own it, and what it means to do so. Contemporary forms of political power, whether implicitly or explicitly, have for 2 centuries grown as dependent on the power of fossil fuels as have economies. As the end of the fossil fuel era approaches, it should thus come as little surprise that competing narratives of energy futures are already in play, each trying to be the first to make sense of what a politics anchored on renewable energy and legitimated by climate action might look like. These narratives are not yet fully coherent ones, and it would not make any sense to expect them to be, as they're now in the process of being tested in the space of uncertainty captured in the IEA's assessment of where we find ourselves. The post-fossil fuel narratives I explore are all attempts to reaffirm status quo forms of political, economic, and technological power. There are other kinds of narratives, those just aren't the ones that I focus on in this book. So I look at the way in which advocates for post-global liberalism, a kind of a liberalism contra populism, argue that liberal nationalism is the only way in which to combat climate change. I also explore the way in which neoliberalism is being extended to decision-making about climate change and energy transition. In this case, the failure of the nation-state to take charge of energy transition is being used by private industry and entrepreneurs as further evidence of the need for them to lead the way in shaping what the world will look like post-2025. That is to say, industry is using the inaction of government in many cases to say that they're the ones that should be trusted with what's happening with renewable transitions. And I end with an assessment of the role energy plays in populist nationalisms, which is what I want to focus on here today. In such nationalisms, energy transition is viewed as a threat to populism's power and legitimacy, and fossil fuel extraction is foregrounded as an essential element of tradition. The degree to which any one of these narratives comes to define the politics of the post-fossil fuel era will depend on its success at becoming the norm against which others are forced to measure themselves. In essence, we can see each struggling to transform itself into the undisputed common sense about how to approach energy transition and climate change. The sociologists and cultural critics Stuart Hall and Alan O'Shea describe common sense as comprising, quote, frameworks of meaning with which to make sense of the world. This sense of common sense shares similarities with what Antonio Gramsci described as spontaneous consent, and it also shares similarities with the use of the term ideology, for instance. But there's a reason why I prefer to use the term common sense. It's because common sense describes positions that subjects and institutions name as irrefutable. The notion of common sense is not just a description of an already achieved state, but names the ongoing active struggle to establish a norm, perhaps especially in situations in which one does not yet exist. Appeals to common sense are a way of bringing people into one's narrative fold, an almost effortless way of defining an us, those who recognize the given and only way of doing things, versus a them, those who, it is implied in the appeal, hold extreme or critical views, or who just don't get it. In other words, common sense is something that has to be made. Each of the narratives of renewable futures at which I look at here makes the case that its views are common sense precisely because they are anything but. The struggle to define a common sense around energy transition involves three competing claims, once again. The globalist environmentalism of liberal capitalist states, the ethical entrepreneurialism exemplified by figures like Bill Gates and the Breakthrough Institutes, and the reactionary anti-eco politics of the right. To explore how this works, I'm going to just look at this ladder. So the populist reaction, or the populist use of energy transition, or the populist use of trying to inhibit energy transition. I'm going to focus on Canada, which is a context I think many of you who are listening to this lecture know well, but give a little bit of a history of the ways in which right-wing politics have fused fossil fuel dependency with libertarian freedoms, conspiracy theories, and nationalist narratives. And we can certainly talk about what this specific kind of right-wing politics looks in relationship to fossil fuels in other national configurations, because it is somewhat different. All right, two parts. The shape of the contemporary politics of fossil fuels in Canada is the outcome of an extended history of intergovernmental conflict over extraction that has now indelibly sutured the identity of the Canadian right to big oil. The origin of the enmity between Alberta and Canada extends back to the 1930s and the birth of the now defunct ultra-conservative Social Credit Party. But the start of the disputes specifically dates to the National Energy Program, which was initiated in 1980 by the Canadian federal government to effectively nationalize aspects of the industry. This was done in part to respond to the financial challenges, the economic challenges of the 1973 oil crisis in Canada. There was fierce and unrelenting opposition to the NEP in Alberta and Western Canada, and still is, led by government and the oil industry, which helped to bring about its end in 1985. A popular bumper sticker at the time read, "Let the Eastern bastards freeze in the dark," a sentiment that remains in place up to the present and is kept alive by industry and government in Alberta, either working separately or, as is more common, working together. The perceived overreach of the federal government on resource control and management was also the impetus behind the formation of the far-right Canadian Alliance and Reform parties, both committed to representing the interests of Western Canadians federally. These parties now form the heart of the contemporary Conservative Party in Canada and the United Conservative Party in Alberta, and some groups even to the right of the UCP. To claim that the desire to control resources was the origin of right-wing populism in Canada would be an overstatement, to be sure. But the claim that there isn't a deep interrelation between the two would be to miss why it is so important for the right in Canada to affirm resource extraction as an essential element of Alberta's heritage and tradition, which it must perpetually defend from all those who want to end it. The threat posed by the NEP has had repercussions in the fossil fuel industry as well. In its wake, industry has ever more aggressively sought to shape public opinion on the importance of extraction to life in Canada. I began these lectures by stating that the era of oil is over, following what the IEA says. There's no doubt, I think there's no doubt that Canadian industry recognizes that the era of oil is coming to an end, especially because one of its main sites of extraction, the Athabasca oil sands, has become a globally recognized sign of everything that is wrong with extractive economies. In response, the Alberta oil industry has sought to legitimate oil sands extraction in whatever way it can. It has supplemented the work sympathetic governments have done on behalf of industry with an increasingly savvy undercover campaign intended to gnaw away at public opposition to its practices. Two examples highlight this, and I could offer many more. The first is the public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaign, established by the government of Alberta, which was tasked with the mission to fight misinformation about oil and gas by environmental advocacy and civil society organizations. This was a remarkable attempt to twist the narrative on what counts as legitimate knowledge about the industry, predating similar efforts being done right now in the United States. It was an attempt to transform environmental groups into antagonists, spreading misinformation instead of, as they claimed, ferreting it out. The second I could point to is the Pathways Alliance, which has publicly articulated a plan for how to achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions from the oil sands by 2050. The alliance was established by the 6 companies that together operate 95% of oil sands production. Canadian Natural, Cenovus, ConocoPhillips, Imperial, MEG Energy, and Suncor. A visit to the Alliance's website shows how expertly industry adapts the language of the Paris Agreement to its explanation of how it intends to achieve net zero. The now standard language of environmental goals to be achieved and newfound commitments to be made to social political issues almost buries the lead. I mean, what I'm saying here is the land acknowledgement, the last time I looked at their website, appears on the bottom of every one of the pages of the website. So they use this kind of standard language of commitments to social political issues, to environmental goals. What it obscures is exactly how they plan to do this, which is to get to net zero not by reducing or eliminating extraction, but by using new technologies such as carbon capture and storage to manage its greenhouse gas production. We can perhaps talk a little bit about Pathways Alliance in the planning made by the new government of Mark Carney for large industrial projects across the country. The supposed commitment of the fossil fuel industry to the tenets of the Paris Agreement is just one approach to get Canadians to remain committed to extraction. Another has been to insist on the specific social and political importance of Canadian oil. The campaign launched by industry and government to explain that oil from the oil sands matters because of its Canadianness has two stages. The first was captured in Ezra Levant's 2010 book, Ethical Oil, The Case for Canada's Oil Sands. Fossil fuels, his argument is simple. Fossil fuels are still necessary. It's common sense. As most countries don't produce enough of their own, they have to buy from somewhere else. Most fossil fuels are produced in petrostates with poor human rights records and led by totalitarian governments, unable to escape the oil curse, Levant says. By contrast, Canada produces a uniquely ethical oil because it originates in a first world democratic country known for being a global leader in human rights. In opposition to environmentalists who want to limit or stop oil sands production, Levant writes, quote, "The question is not whether we should use oil sands oil instead of some perfect fantasy fuel that hasn't been invented yet. Until that miracle fuel is invented, the question is whether we should use oil from the oil sands or oil from the other places in the world that pump it." In the years immediately following the publication of Levant's book, ethical oil was widely employed by industry to reinforce the legitimacy of continued extraction until the term faded from widespread use. The notion of ethical oil was revived then in 2018 by Ontario Proud, a right-wing group committed to returning power to the people, in a series of ads and via its website Stop Saudi Oil, an older message perfectly suited to the xenophobic Trump era. Now, there's another variant of this approach of linking oil to Canadianness, linking oil to a certain national identity, essentially. And that's been the industry's own frequent assertions that it represents Canadian values and plays an essential role in the life of the country. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, or CAP, has mounted several increasingly sophisticated campaigns along these lines. Its Raise Your Hand for Canada campaign shows pictures of mostly white Canadians holding a hand up, finger spread, over which is pasted the outline of a maple leaf. The concluding lines of the ad copy ask the question, "Think energy developed the Canadian way is good for Canada?" The answer the CAP wants to hear, then now is the time to say so by raising your hand. The latest campaign to marry oil with Canadian values was initiated in the wake of the war in Ukraine. The website Made the Canadian Way asks, if your oil and gas came with a label, what would you learn? The label posted online tells us that Canada's oil and gas are innovation-driven and responsibly produced. This campaign was mounted by the Canadian Energy Centre, which was created by the government of Alberta to support industry in whatever way possible. Indeed, it is this center that was responsible for the public inquiry report I mentioned earlier. So what's the takeaway from these government and industry campaigns? Are we supposed to understand fossil fuels as a good belonging to all Canadians, as industry and campaigns seem to suggest, or to Albertans alone, which is often the standpoint of the Alberta government? Is industry genuinely committed to decarbonizing, or do all such claims constitute little more than greenwashing? The National Energy Program is long dead. How then are we meant to understand the current relationship between the federal and provincial governments? Large segments of the public, both inside and outside Alberta, continue to believe that the federal government is impeding the financial success of the fossil fuel industry and so must be resisted. 4 decades on, the legacy of the National Energy Program has been rewritten by successive right-wing governments and their industry comrades in a way that has made the private appear to be public. That is, in these campaigns, it's always stated that the Canadian public owns the oil as if it's already nationalized, when in fact it is owned by private industry. So it manages to make the private appear to be public, even while managing to retain the notion that there's a danger that the federal government will nationalize the oil industry. Very twisted logic. Rendering oil ownership this way has proved to be, however, incredibly effective common sense that has made any thought of changes to the dominant energy system in Canada hard to parse. You can already hear in the way I've described it that this political common sense and this energy common sense that continues to shape political decision making in Canada, it's full of contradictions, and deliberately so. It's organized around oppositions that can flip-flop as needed, from being in favor of business to apparently being against it, from opposing nationalism to embracing it. What's certain, though, is that energy transition and environmental policies, even to a limited degree, have been positioned as threats to established political systems whose ongoing legitimacy deeply depends on continuing fossil fuel extraction. To the frustrated middle classes created by neoliberalism, industry and their government representatives have repeatedly offered an answer about what's gone wrong. Misguided technocrats are messing with resources essential to their self-identity and livelihood, and doing so by employing globalist environmental policies that fail to attend to national identity or provincial identity, depending on what they want to assert at any given moment. The result is that in Canada, the xenophobia of right-wing populisms has been shaped not only by exclusions defined by race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation, but by differences with respect to energy resources, a unique political configuration with serious consequences for energy transition and climate action in this country. Given all of these confusions I've just described, which shape belonging, tradition, private, and public into complex figures, it's perhaps unsurprising that adding one more ingredient to this stew of ideas, positions, and counterpositions would generate new uncertainties that would result in a crisis. The month-long Freedom Convoy, which made its way across Canada before reaching Ottawa on January 29th, 2021, was kicked off by just such an event, which mobilized the center-periphery narratives developed around extraction to new ends. The extended occupation of downtown Ottawa in and around Parliament Hill was the immediate result of the imposition of vaccine mandates on truckers crossing the US-Canadian border, which frustrated truckers which frustrated those truckers that decided not to vaccinate. To show their displeasure at the vaccine mandate and its impact on their livelihoods, a small minority of Canada's long-haul truckers, accompanied by their supporters, descended on the nation's capital to vent their frustrations. Now, this protest was actually never very was never very large. On the first day of its gathering in Ottawa, there were an estimated 8,000 protesters. Compare this to a 2019 climate march in Montreal that involved up to the estimates are up to 500,000 people. By the day after the first day of the gathering, the numbers had dropped to fewer than half, with a continuing decline over the life of the protest. The Freedom Convoy ended on February 23rd after the imposition of the Emergencies Act, a seldom employed act that grants temporary power to the federal government to deal with emergencies it views as threats to the country's sovereignty and security. But the convoy had a real impact, despite its small size and the length of time it occupied Ottawa. Then the X-ray it offered of the contemporary state of Canadian political life. The hesitation at all levels of government to intervene in this month-long protests highlights the power of an emerging common sense that can transform all contestation into an affirmation of the reality of its paranoid outlook on the world. There was always something off about the accepted narrative of the principal cause of the protest. After all, it was the imposition of the US vaccine mandate for cross-border travel that impeded non-Canadian truckers from hauling goods across the border, not a law imposed by the Canadian federal government, a fact that convoy organizers conveniently avoided mentioning. The initial demands for an end to the government vaccine mandate very quickly transformed into a clarion call for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau to leave office. This was perhaps to be expected. Neither Tamara Lich nor B.J. Dichter, the organizers of the GoFundMe and Give, Send, Go campaigns used to generate support for the convoy, neither was a trucker, nor was Ontario convoy organizer Jason Laface, a member of the ultra-right group Canada Unity. All three had been associated with prior anti-federal movements. Litch was a member of the Maverick Party, previously known as Wexit, which advocated for the independence of Western Canada from the rest of the country, for instance. Read generously, the Freedom Convoy could be seen as an expression of general frustration against the government, a government unable or unwilling to address the concerns of ordinary Canadians. When asked by the media what the demands of the convoy were, Dichter, for instance, said, "It's everything, everything." But the reality is more ominous. In addition to a familiar Western separatist ideology of the kind framed in relation to control over oil extraction, it's clear that the imperatives of the convoy were shaped, at least in part, by QAnon and other conspiracy theorists and a range of US-based right-wing groups. A hack of the donor list of the Give, Send, Go campaign confirmed this. 55% of the donors were from the United States and included prominent donors to Donald Trump's campaign, a far greater indication of US involvement in Canadian politics than that found previously by the public inquiry into anti-Alberta energy campaigns, the one I mentioned earlier, which it concluded, by the way, that foreign money given to NGOs opposed to oil sands was insignificant. The convoy may have been framed in response to a vaccine mandate as unpopular as Bill Gates is in some parts of the country. According to Google Trends, these two topics share consonant levels of online searches by Canadians. But at its core, this protest was about fossil fuels. To mobilize its participants, the organizers depended on the persistence of a regional politics anchored in deep-seated political disputes originating as far back as the National Energy Program. The right-wing ability to generate legitimacy for its positions by sliding from federal to provincial and back again allowed it to maintain a persistent confusion about the coronavirus pandemic. the federal government was held wholly culpable for an issue that fell under provincial jurisdiction. Under the terms of the Canadian Constitution, provinces are responsible for the provision of health. In the wake of its quick abandonment of the plight of the unvaccinated truckers, one of the main demand organizers of the convoy made was for the Governor General to dissolve government, which they cannot do unless the government has lost the confidence of the House of Commons. It's unlikely that anything would have been gained by suggesting to the organizers and convoy participants that they read up on the Constitution. No argument could possibly cut the ideologically taut Gordian knot that binds two contradictory ideas together. The rejection of any and every action of government. Remember Dichter's statement, it's everything, everything. And the demand that that self-same government, whose every action is to be rejected, act to undo itself. The hope that government might be able to undo the wrong it represents due to its very existence is further complicated by the starting premise of the convoy organizers that it can only ever manage to mess things up. The Canadian politics of fossil fuels can be seen as key to the convoy in even more direct ways. The 2022 Freedom Convoy, the Freedom Convoy built on the lessons of an earlier truck convoy to Ottawa. In February 2019, United We Roll brought hundreds of truckers to Ottawa to protest the federal government's introduction of a carbon tax and the development of strengthened environmental assessments of energy projects, as well as its ban on oil tankers on the northern coast of British Columbia. Some of those at the 2019 protests were also there to express their displeasure at the drop in oil prices. A bizarre demand, if not for the view held by many Canadians that the government has at least some control over prices. United We Roll was the concluding act of Canada's own version of the Gilets jaunes protests, which saw yellow-vested Canadians protesting simultaneously against greenhouse gas policies and cultural threats posed by Muslims, immigrants, and the LGBTQ community. More recently, there have been calls for yet another convoy, which is now over, given that Trudeau is out of power. Trudeau was really the object of many of these actions as well. But that earlier convoy, it was called because the Trudeau government announced the aim of a 30% absolute reduction in nitrous oxide emissions from fertilizer use. So this was refigured in 2024 by some alt-right media outlets as an initiative to ban the use of fertilizers altogether. Finally, the importance of oil for life in Canada is affirmed in the very form taken by the Freedom Convoy. A protest built out of trucks and saturated by the petro-masculinity and petro-populism connected with convoys ever since the release of the 1978 film of the same name, Convoy, which was also, as my colleague Caleb Wellham has shown, linked very directly as a response to the 1973 oil crisis in the United States. The confusing landscape of popular politics I've just painted isn't unique to Canada, even though the degree to which the right has connected it with the oil industry might be. In his 1995 essay, Fascism, Umberto Eco argues that fascism is grounded in a cult of tradition, but a tradition that is syncretistic, a combination of different forms of belief that must tolerate contradiction. In Canada, fossil fuels have shaped right-wing notions of tradition that have proven able to easily navigate such contradictions. The implications of the right's political syncretism are obvious. Nothing needs to be done with the natural world as long as it remains the place where money magically flows from the ground. To do anything about climate change is to be both anti-Canadian and dangerously opposed to tradition. All right, so this is my second part, and it's wrapping up quickly. So I'm asked all the time when I give presentations, usually gloomy presentations about climate change and about transition, kind of what should we do? What are the kinds of responses that we might have? As if I would have any idea of what to do with such a giant issue. But I wanted to give a try at something here, and I do so in the book as well. I've been talking about this idea of tradition that has come up many times. Umberto Eco talks about it here, the way in which populisms and fascism speak very much to ideas of tradition. They mobilize tradition to give legitimacy to positions that they hold. Tradition is a way to generate a common sense. Tradition makes a deep claim on common sense. If something has always been done a certain way, that must mean that it is legitimate just by that very fact. Of course, all of that is invented, but it doesn't mean that it doesn't have an impact nevertheless. So let me take a try here at something. What might be an appropriate rejoinder to these ideologies of resource extraction? An answer at once conceptual and political that would unnerve the attempt of the right to lay claim to common sense on energy and our climate futures. The obvious answer, the go-to answer that has often been offered is science. Of course, a discourse imagined to be able to puncture through the fictions and conspiracies on which the right depends to strengthen and grow. But science has proven to be limited in its capacities to articulate a new common sense, in part because it positions itself entirely outside of the political spectrum, which we might see as a virtue, but which doesn't work very well as a political response to a political position. That's one of the issues with science, but it's also because it can be so easy to frame it as a fiction articulated by government or industry to suppress rights and freedoms. Science has animated right-wing conspiracies rather than bringing unbelievers into the fold all too often. It also, unfortunately, has limited capacity to mobilize action on climate change, even among individuals and polities that recognize the import and significance of its findings. Simply knowing the kinds of information and statistics in charts of the kind with which I started this discussion is not enough for that to translate into any kind of political action. But what about this notion of tradition? The category that lies at the heart of right-wing populisms and fascisms, the lost object that reactionaries always wish to recover. Is this something that we can potentially mobilize for climate action and against the kind of reactionary politics of fossil fuels that exist in a place like Canada? There's no doubt that tradition can be exclusionary, violent, degrading, and demoralizing. And so one can thus be forgiven for thinking that history has little in it to mount substantial challenges to the narratives I've examined here. But tradition is not the same as history. It can be shaped to many ends, as the right knows so well. Tradition makes a demand on the present that can be harder to deny than threats posed by an unknown future. Consider the kinds of ideas that might be folded into tradition to challenge the legitimacy of status quo narratives. The common comes before capitalism. That can certainly be said to be tradition. Community precedes divisions and separations. The nation is little more than a fiction, as it is, made up as a form of political belonging. And earth, water, sky, and air, and certainly the energy of the sun belong to everyone. The historian and cultural critic Raymond Williams points to tradition as the most powerful mechanism of social incorporation and is fundamental to all politics. For Williams, it is a way in which, quote, from a whole possible area of past and present in a particular culture, certain meanings and practices are selected for emphasis and certain other meanings and practices are neglected or excluded. The problem is thus, it seems to me, not tradition per se, but seeing it as fixed and unshakable, something about which nothing more can be said, because the passage of time has made all that has come to be into a common sense that cannot be challenged. Conceding tradition to the status quo, perhaps and unfortunately, might mean forgoing its potential as a powerful political tool to unnerve the powers that be. It would be wrong to suggest that there's no tradition of left political achievement or gains made or goals reached. And given what the surviving past looks like, progressives can be forgiven for avoiding tradition, perhaps especially those wishing to insist on the necessity of quick action on energy transition and climate change. After all, the past is a record of climate failure, and what we need now is climate success. But along with Williams, I think it might be essential for those committed to climate action to make a claim on tradition, even if only as a political rhetoric, a means of myth-making to political ends. So just how might such a use of tradition work in the context that I've been describing? Before the Freedom Convoy came the United We Roll convoy. They were animated by similar aims and intentions, and the former drew considerable political energy from the example of the latter. But another convoy headed towards Ottawa well before the right-wingers guzzled gas on their way to Parliament Hill. In June 1935, 1,000 residents of a federal unemployment relief camp left Vancouver to take their protests over poor living conditions to Ottawa. Those in the On to Ottawa Trek, as it was called, commandeered freight trains to speed their process across the continent. The train convoy picked up strikers along the way, doubling its size by the time it reached Regina, where further progress was blocked by the order of the Prime Minister R.B. Bennett. Talks to address the strikers' concerns were initiated with the office of the Prime Minister, but quickly broke down. Bennett's decision to arrest the trekkers resulted in the Regina riot, which brought the trek to an end. It also brought an end to Bennett's career and fueled interest in the Canadian Communist Party, which had provided support to the trek. Might one critique of the Freedom Convoy be that it dishonored the tradition of the onto Ottawa trek, which was made up of men wanting to be paid more than the 20 cents per day they received for their work? A far cry from the current convoy's inchoate demands for the Prime Minister to resign just because a few people wanted him to do so? Might this have offered those who participated in the recent convoy, many of whom have been left behind politically and economically by neoliberalism, might the evidence and example of this earlier convoy, might it have given them new insight into the injustices and the origins and the reasons for the injustices that have been visited upon them today? And might there be a way of seeing Canada's national energy program in the 1980s not as a failure, but as a program intent on honoring a commitment to equality among Canadians, including equality with respect to their resources? In an era of climate change, the restitution of a program like the National Energy Program, which to be sure was not without its problems, could change the direction of resource politics in Canada. Instead, the federal government has chosen to support industry, for example, by purchasing the controversial Trans Mountain Pipeline from Kinder Morgan in 2018, and it looks like it will do so again through the projects that it will carry out over at least the next 5 years. A new program to bring about energy transition would bring us nowhere close to the common imagined in political philosophy, but it is a step in a process that may well be crucial to achieving real transition and truly is addressing the causes and consequences of climate change. The power of common sense comes from the immediate intuitive claim it can make to speak on behalf of the center. that apparently non-ideological, inclusive, and democratic space, the center, in which the only statements made are ones on which everyone already agrees. In making this claim, common sense asserts its right to speak for the most saleable aspects of tradition. The end of the oil era does not denote the end of capitalism, nor does the expanding use of renewable energy produce ipso facto new, far better ways of living together and in the world. A world of clean energy can fuel a world, after all, shaped by racism, sexism, and discrimination of all kinds. The future of the sun won't depend on the technological sophistication of solar panels and the storage capacity of batteries. It will depend on our willingness to forcefully challenge those narratives of energy transition that promise change while insisting that we keep everything exactly as it is. It will depend too on our ability to tell convincing stories about the traditions we need and want to honor, and those to which it is no longer worth paying any attention because they've gotten us nowhere. Thank you very much. Now I've got to figure out how to end my sharing as I failed to before. Here we go. All right.
Professor Zeman, thank you so much for a characteristically excellent and provocative talk. Thank you. I hope you're noticing some comments in the chat that are coming in as well. I'd also like to thank everyone for showing up today, and for those of you that are able to stay. In Imra's opening remarks, he was really encouraging us to engage in discussion about the presentation that we have heard today. I hope that that was on your mind as you were listening, and I'd like to now open the floor to comments, questions, and begin some of that discussion that Imra, you've done a wonderful job of catalyzing, I think, today. Thank you. Nancy, I'll just check in, just a logistics question. Are we still asking for questions in the chat? I wonder if with a group this size, can we try to manage folks raising hands and going from there? I'll scale that suggestion back if it goes off the rails.
Definitely. We can do either or.
Let's try raising hands. I think that's maybe a little more intuitive for folks, but also if you would prefer, if anyone's online, they would prefer to pop your question in the chat, I'll keep an eye on that too and repeat it for you. Anyone care to get us started? Ian, please go ahead.
I'll break
Thanks.
the ice. Hi,
I
very
love
nice
that. Thank you,
to
Ian.
see
You're my
you.
favorite so far.
Nice to see you again. I work in Durham region, so east of Toronto. And one of the sort of narratives we're seeing a lot is sort of the 15-minute city stuff. And I just wanted, like, that keeps coming up again and again. And I just, is reflecting on your talk, like, I think there's that sort of, and I'm sure everyone knows the anti-15-minute city, that we're trying to put people in districts and, microchip them and prevent them from, moving beyond, take away their cars, etc. And I was reflecting on your talk and about sort of the use of, tradition. I think there's something really, valuable and important there, that, a 15-minute city can be a very beautiful thing, with connection to people and meaning, and, an ability to sort of, the baker and the pharmacist and knowing everyone.
Right.
So I'm just thinking on that. I mean, it's not a new thought for me, but I think it is really important for us to, your point of trying not letting the conspiracist like, use tradition, or be the only ones that sort of, use that framing. So that, I guess, maybe just more of a comment than a question,
Sure.
but I think that's something from a local government perspective that we're seeing a lot of. And I think, yeah, the 15-minute city, I think, is really wrapped up in the fossil fuel narrative, right? That the idea that we should be free to drive for hours to do whatever we want is really wrapped up in the sort of fossil fuel narrative, I think. So I don't know, maybe a bit of a rambling thought there, but
No, that's great. That's great.
thank you.
Good to see you, Ian. So there's two, I hadn't thought about the 15-minute city, but I think the way you framed it is quite excellent. So the way that the 15-minute city is presented, the way that it appears to people, how it comes from people, is that it is a initiative from government, from technocrats, that is kind of baseless. It's like even if it's understood why it's being done, so you can get rid of the conspiracy part. It's seen as managerial. It's seen as kind of another example of something that might be bad. It's kind of artificial. And the city that we have now is somehow organic. That I think is what comes out of a lot of the response to it. And organic by the fact that people feel like they can get anywhere they want. But tradition does fit into it in several ways. So one is in a small town Ontario, let's just say. You don't go back to, these are such big stereotypes, so I'm just going to put them out there. You don't go back to visit your family and then you're excited to drive around. There's something exciting about the little town you walk around when one goes on vacation and goes to Europe, let's just say. The exciting thing is look how much you can do just by walking around. I'm not sure that if somebody goes to Europe, and perhaps the people I'm thinking of don't go to Europe, you go to some other place. It can be most cities in the world. The first thing you do is not complain that you can't, take your car down the side streets. So there's a sense of where, I suppose it's where the initiative is coming from and what it's impeding or what it's enabling. And if it's made to seem like putting something back, possibilities that you didn't have, as opposed to restricting, that might be a way to do that. The automobile makes it very difficult. The automobile historically has a very specific history that's going to be difficult to get rid of. And I don't mean highways and the need to get around with them and that you can't shop, you can't get your groceries because of how diffuse cities have become. I mean the kind of psychological way in which it got framed early on. So initially when cars were developed, they were something only elites could have. At least as an argument that some have made culturally. When it became a mass object, then suddenly everybody could be as if they were elite. They could also move around in space. They had the capacity to go wherever they wanted. It reaffirms very, very powerfully the most libertarian tendencies that we have. We don't tend to think about community when we're driving around in a car. Other people are in pain. They're in the way. Yeah, I was on 401 the other day and I gave up all of my community feelings. I was just kind of like, every one of these people should not be here. I just want to move through space. So the car is a very specific object that I think requires a lot of work on the part of those that want to change practices in relation to that. And I think I could go on, but that to me is a hurdle that I don't quite know myself. Other people have thought about this a lot more, but affirming the need for transit vis-a-vis a car from the top down is not a very powerful argument in the political climate that is developed right now in the context of North America. It again comes across as conspiratorial. So yeah, I'm not sure there. I think the 15-minute city is more solvable though. Maybe don't call it 15 minutes, just call it like, we're going to make it's going to be like your
complete community.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right.
Or a complete street.
Okay, I'll go with that. I'll use that next time.
Thank you, Ian. A great question. And I think too, I myself, I live in Oshawa, and I know there are others on this call because the Earth District as a consortium brings us together, that are drawn from multiple institutions, or consortium, institutional partners that are based in Oshawa, where the car as an object of tradition, as a really freighted one, is of course right in the center of a city's identity and what labor has historically been understood to mean in this place. So I think your comments about the car and that what you've just been offering, Imra, may well be, I think, an excellent continued discussion for the Earth District, just given our the facts of our locality and how our consortium is constituted. I will open up the floor to other comments and responses, as we can see, whether it's a fully fledged thought or a question. All are welcome here.
Maybe I'll just say one other thing about the car.
Please.
In High Park in Toronto, if you go to the little place where you can buy ice creams and so on, there is a lots of brochures there, and they're from advocates. They're advocating something for the park. And so I was there the other day. I went to see what those brochures were about, and because I had thought it was maybe about rewilding the park or leaving it as it is. No, they were all about the threat that was being launched to closing the park to cars, the possibility that you couldn't drive through the park. And they're quite robust. They had, stickers and pamphlets and a sign-up sheet. And that made me realize once again how difficult it is to the car specifically is the creature that has to be reimagined some way, and I think tradition might do that. I'm not quite sure how that would be. It wouldn't be like we used to ride horses, right? It's not that, but this sense in Canada that I was just remarking to a friend, I can't think of that as an issue in other places I know of with city parks like that. So, and I don't mean Europe, I mean globally. So I'm kind of like, what is the threat then to not driving through the park? I'm curious. I almost want to contact these people and have a discussion. So,
Christy, please go ahead. Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Imra. It's so great to finally hear you give this lecture. I missed a couple of different times where I planned to hear you talk about the book, and I'm so glad I did today. And while it doesn't feel like common sense, it does feel to me to make so much sense. just the way that you've intricately woven all of these big questions together into the challenge that we all face in our work around responding to climate. I kind of had two questions or two areas of questions that weren't fully developed, and then after hearing the talk about the 15-minute city and this example of Hyde Park, it makes me think of maybe something that's closer to a question. So I'm interested in the two ideas of one, tradition, like what is I really am fascinated by this idea. What does tradition look like when it's not top down, when it's smaller, when it's more generative? And maybe I can just put my cards on the table and saying, like, sometimes social movements are blame directing, for example. And so that's not always as generative or constructive in all ways, but totally useful and necessary also. And then the other sort of cluster of issues that I've been thinking about is the kind of unassailable right that we all think that we have in North America in particular, as consumerist, individualist society, to choice, to always having a choice. I should have the right to drive my car through High Park. I should have. How dare you try and stop me from speeding down the street beside High Park? Where people are walking with their children and their dogs daily. And for those of you who aren't in downtown Toronto, I think the story is that the speed camera on that street has been knocked down 7 times this year. And now, you know, in the media, it's like there's a ton of support for no controls on drivers. So, anyways, so I'm, you know, I'm talking too long, but what can we do? What kind of traditions can we create? Not to remove choice, but to but just for people. Yeah, I don't know. How do we think more about the community part and less about the options for my convenience part, I suppose.
Okay, that's an excellent set of questions and concerns, and which are hard questions. Let me take them, and I hope I can address them all. A part of the book that would normally have been stuck in this discussion, I just had to take it out because it'd be too long, has to do with the ways in which different sides of the political spectrum see their task and how they narrate something. So you're right. I would say, again, these are very broad characterizations. They don't get everything. There can be a way in which on the left, the great power and function and importance is to challenge the status quo, given its limitations, given the ways in which it doesn't necessarily, it's the status quo, it's common sense. It doesn't investigate the way in which that common sense has been constituted. So common sense, only certain people can hold hands on the street. A lot of effort goes into sort of saying, why is that important to you? Like, and that can be, there's a lot of work to be done for that. What some philosophers and political scientists have said that kind of negative critique, what it leaves out is a constructive part. And a constructive part that is quite deliberate and rhetorical and is okay with its own fictions. So the left is very alert to fictions as they see them as harmful. So what I mean by that is that if you're on the right, your task is entirely about, I'm going to contain something that's being lost. And so you're going to fill it with content. You have a sense of what those things are. And they can look bizarre and they can be empty, like they don't have to have any relationship to anything that's happened. I feel like if the power of that activity is conceded to the right, then there's a whole capacity that's missing, right? So it's kind of like this. I've been thinking a lot about like at its core, all populisms are reactionary, but the Trump populism is built around a fantasy image of 1950s Americana, which never existed, but one in which you go into it's also very masculine. So that's the example I'm going to use. Like you and dad go into the driveway on the weekend and you work on the car underneath the car. And so there's a desire to have that kind of car again. And you do that after you spend your time in the coal fields doing this kind of physical labor. And it turns out that it's never like that. That's kind of like on Happy Days or something. I don't know where that image comes from, but it's very important to the identity of those who see this, not because they particularly value that, but they value that it has some stability. Now, if what you say is what like kind of I say, today Paul Krugman pointed out in his Substack that the number of people in the US still working in the mining industry is less than the number of students on the main campus of University of Illinois. So to point out, like, that's not an industry that's worth anything. I don't provide much of a next step. I say something kind of like the market will dictate what makes more sense, and that provides that same kind of instability. So if there's something else I could provide, I too am going on too long, but I do think we shouldn't concede the power of tradition, even if what we're doing is we're building our own sense of what that tradition is out of all of the resources that exist historically for doing that. So it's not completely an invention, but it's recovering what it is that we think is very important to it. And I'd like to see that be actively done. It is done by some communities more than others. And unfortunately, it has been a more reactionary practice than a progressive one. I'm just curious about that possibility. I think Raymond Williams is right not to leave it. Now, when it comes to like the speed cameras, again, a really for somebody like me working on these issues that totally fascinate. It's like it's made for me to like write about or something. It it is odd in so many ways. It's this sense. The first thing I wanted to say about that is that, like all these other things I was looking at, it's a minority practice, and it is not approved by a majority, and then it is confirmed as a common sense when the government or the political class uses it to treat it as like a standard practice. So whether or not, if Doug Ford's government was to read the polls and like 5% of people reacted in this way, the kind of way it gets framed is it's just dangerous to not go at it in this way. There's too much danger in seeing it as technocratic, conspiratorial, etc. It feeds into all of the worries that people have about the social media era, Web 2.0, Web 3.0, and so on. So there too, there's just other ways to do it, which would be about it's like, well, I always feel like, where are you going so fast? I'm not sure if you get like on that street, Parkside, there's a light every few blocks. Like I don't even know how you go faster. If you still want to do the same kind of thing, what is done elsewhere in the world, again, not like everywhere I know of, or you just put speed bumps. So then the question is, why isn't that done? There's something specific about the camera that is an issue. So it's been cut down there, now it's being cut down all over the place. But there too, just a more robust discussion about how you can still have personal freedoms, um, even when there's decisions made that benefit everybody. One is seen to be canceling out the other.
Yeah.
And that libertarian streak is connected to specific practices and tendencies. And that is hard to shake when you're allowed or not allowed. It's just the case that we are comprised of these incredible sets of contradictions of the kind that I was describing in the way that Canadians imagine oil in relationship to their identities and so on. I'm not sure this answers anything. I guess I'm just kind of saying there are resources that we need to turn to. I'm not the first to say this, but that go beyond the technical knowledge of how to fix systems, because those do not seem to be having the impact that we might hope.
Yeah, totally agree. Thank you.
Great. Professor Zeman, you've been very generous with your time and with your work, sharing it here as part of the Earth District Speaker Series this year. Thanks to you again and so much, and to everyone who attended today and who will attend as this is being recorded and will be posted. I hope those of you in attendance today might spread the word to your colleagues, particularly those who are in educator positions, and really encourage whether it's your friends, colleagues, your community, but certainly your students, should you have access to those wonderful beings. Encourage encourage them, please, to take advantage of this incredible resource and the wonderful knowledge of Professor Zeman and his work, The Futures of the Sun. I'll just say that by way of advertisement, our next session is going to be on November 20th and will be led by Faridun Dibba, who is the director and principal researcher at Fleming College, and Mehdi Sanjari, who is the CEO of AI Innovate. I think there'll be a link in the chat to register for that session, and we will also be providing more old-fashioned ways to sign up for that session through email and so on. With that being said, I think that's the conclusion for our session today. Thank you, Professor Zeman, and thanks to each of you for participating and listening today. Take care and have a good one.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.